Following President Trump's racist video, Oaklandsocialist appeared on Davey D. Cook's Hard Knock Radio. Here is a recording of the discussion that we had.
Radio hanging out with you this afternoon. Late last week, many of us woke up and either saw or heard about a disturbing post that came from this current administration. The meme that most people saw depicted Michelle Obama and Barack Obama as apes. It was, it set off a firestorm. Set off a firestorm for a few reasons. One, it's a post that came from the current president. And one would ask, why would a president depict two people who were admired, whether you agreed with their politics or not, around the country, and mean a lot to a whole lot of people, with a racist trope of them being apes. This is not the first time we've seen the Obamas depicted that way. Michelle Obama was often referred to as a man. We saw all sorts of stereotypes, and the ape one was one that was pretty consistent. Our guest, John Ryman, who runs Oaklandsocialist, that is a blog, and also longtime union organizer, reminded us in one of his latest posts that there was much more to that meme than the racism that was pretty overt, and that we should pay full attention to what the overriding message was in that post. And so we wanted to invite him on to share with us his analysis, as well as a number of other things that he's been really pushing, including for unions to really stand up and meet this challenge, meet this moment. So, John, welcome to the show. And you wrote a column and astutely pointed out there was much more to the meme than the overt racism. So thank you for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for having me on. And I'd like to back up for a minute in the first place, we know Trump's method is something like a magician who has a fast patter, waves his left hand around so you don't pay attention to what his right hand is doing. And that's what he did in that video, as an example. But, this is not the first time that Trump has made overtly racist comments. And people tend to be outraged, and then the next outrage comes up, and they forget about the previous one. And we tend to become desensitized to all of this. And also, I think we tend not to consciously draw the conclusion that has to be drawn, which is that the way that capitalism has ruled over the last nearly 200 years, that is, since the Civil War, is not going to necessarily continue under what I think should be called the Trump, Vance, Miller imperial presidency. And we should just remind ourselves of a couple of things. Number one is the absolutely unprecedented level of corruption. For instance, now, which everybody has forgotten about, I think, or almost everybody, you have Trump suing the IRS, and in other words, for $8 billion. In other words, a plan to transfer your taxes from the federal government directly into his own pocket. That kind of thing is unprecedented. You have the military invasion and open assassination of two people in Minneapolis. You have the raid on Fulton County. And as far as that video, the point is, we have to remember exactly, in the first place, there was a reason that he left it up for 12 hours and then took it down. And it was not because a bunch of Republicans objected to it, Republican politicians. But what happened, so in that video, the message was, the first part of the message, which is entirely unremarked upon, was that the 2020 elections were stolen by Biden. That same meme. Now you have to take that in the context of his raid on Fulton County and so on. The second part of the message was that what I'm the Lion King, and I will dominate all possible opponents. And the overt racism, in terms of his the meme about the Obamas, the message behind that is that I will use overt racism in order to determine the outcome of the elections coming up later this year. That is his message. And the New York Times recently had an editorial, and the New York Times editors are not exactly the most radical force in American society, in which they explained that we are moving towards overt autocracy, and as they say, that they warn that Trump will use his power to overturn the elections coming up later this year, and they say, quote, once that stage is reached, however, the change is extremely difficult to reverse. In other words, just simply elections will not reverse that. And so that is the real message behind the overt racism, and as part of the general message of that video.
John, for many people that are listening, I think they hear clearly what is being said. It's a sobering message. For many people, it's overwhelming. Many will try to push it off to the side because there are more immediate concerns. And to your point, it's easier to get angry, and justifiably so, about the overt racism that is continuously being displayed by this administration while they're putting firm bricks and cementing institutions in a way that it's going to be hard for us to reverse them. Even if this man disappears, what is being put in place is going to be very, very difficult for us to dismantle. That can be a challenge. How do we reach people, or is there a path that people can take where they can see themselves moving in a forward direction? They can maybe see a light at the end of the tunnel and not just feel so overwhelmed.
Yeah, well, in the first place, I do think that a lot of people kind of unconsciously do think, look, the way America has been ruled since the Civil War, one way or another, it's going to continue. I do think that a lot of people kind of feel that unconsciously. The other point I would like to make is that we do have to, the way I envision this situation is, imagine if you were in a canoe with the people that you care the most about, and you're headed down the river, headed towards the Niagara Falls, and you're desperately trying to paddle to the shore before you get to the falls. And you don't know if you're going to make it or not, but you know that you have to try. That's how I think we should see this situation. And I think that there is a force that nobody recognizes, because the leadership of that force has been entirely silent. They've been entirely missing in action for so long that we don't even think about them. And that is the potential power of the labor movement, which the leadership of that movement, ever since I've been active, which is basically since about 1965, the leadership of that movement has done everything that it can to suppress the best traditions of the U.S. labor movement and the U.S. working class. And so that is where we have to start. And if you look, for instance, in Minneapolis, there was big talk about the general strike of January 23rd. Well, it wasn't really a general strike. And the union leadership was nearly completely silent, and has remained nearly completely silent. And they've been so silent for so long that you don't even notice it. But if you think about things, Davey D, the unions could shut down air transport, shipping, and railroads. That would bring this country to a complete halt. And
well, this comes to what I was getting at. Let's, for the sake of discussion, just assume that the way we've seen capitulation from universities, the way that we've seen capitulation by legacy media, the ABCs and the CBSs of the world, and a number of other institutions. The leadership there has been compromised, and we see them acquiescing to this administration. So I'm going to assume that the potential power of unions would lead to its leadership, whoever's the president or the CEO or whatever title is given, they're going to be out to lunch. But the rank and file still exists, and that's where I come back to this challenge. Many people are hoping, John, I hear you, but before I go to the streets, let's see if these elections will work. That's what I think a lot of people are feeling. I don't want to have to pick up a stick. I don't want to have to pick up a pitchfork. I don't want to have to pick up a gun. I don't want to do something that is going to be irreparable. So if I go out there and I start swinging and I miss, there's going to be a price for me to personally pay. So I don't want to make that decision right now. So I think I'm going to put all my eggs in the basket to vote. And so the question becomes, if leadership is compromised, how do you reach the rank and file? Because, or can the rank and file act on their own?
I think that's really, in a way, the question of the hour that you raised. And first of all, I'd like to point out, as you say, probably the majority of people who are not in the MAGA crowd are thinking, well, let's try the elections first. And that's my point is, as I said, that a lot of people unconsciously think that the same old methods will work again. Now, as to the question that you raised, I think that one part of it, we have to realize there is massive discontent within the membership, including amongst the MAGA supporters of the union members. There's massive discontent at the degree to which the union leadership has sold out the membership just in terms of wages, hours, working conditions, and so on. So there is that discontent there. And then I would like to raise a couple of countervailing examples. I'm sure you remember, Davey D, the so-called battle in Seattle in, what was that then, 1999, I believe it was. The battle in Seattle against the World Trade Organization. And what happened there? The union leadership tried to have a nice, safe little rally of their members in a stadium somewhere, and the youth went into the streets and faced down the police, the tear gas, and so on. And what happened to the union membership? The great majority of them went with the youth. So you've seen that. And so I do think that if you connect that with the discontent that the great majority of members feel towards their own leadership, that there is the potential for a movement within the labor movement, the rank and file movement. And it won't be easy. There's no guarantee that it'll succeed, but I'd just like to remind people of that analogy that I made to being in a canoe headed down the river towards the Niagara Falls.
For the sake of discussion, just assume that the way we've seen capitulation from universities, the way that we've seen capitulation by legacy media, the ABCs and the CBSs of the world, and a number of other institutions, the leadership there has been compromised, and we see them acquiescing to this administration. So I'm going to assume that the potential power of unions would lead to its leadership, whoever's the president or the CEO or whatever title is given, they're going to be out to lunch. But the rank and file still exists, and that's where I come back to this challenge. Many people are hoping, John, I hear you, but before I go to the streets, let's see if these elections will work. That's what I think a lot of people are feeling. I don't want to have to pick up a stick. I don't want to have to pick up a pitchfork. I don't want to have to pick up a gun. I don't want to do something that is going to be irreparable. So if I go out there and I start swinging and I miss, there's going to be a price for me to personally pay. So I don't want to make that decision right now. So I think I'm going to put all my eggs in the basket to vote. And so the question becomes, if leadership is compromised, how do you reach the rank and file? Because, or can the rank and file act on their own?
I think that's really, in a way, the question of the hour that you raised. And first of all, I'd like to point out, as you say, probably the majority of people who are not in the MAGA crowd are thinking, well, let's try the elections first. And that's my point is, as I said, that a lot of people unconsciously think that the same old methods will work again. Now, as to the question that you raised, I think that one part of it, we have to realize there is massive discontent within the membership, including amongst the MAGA supporters of the union members. There's massive discontent at the degree to which the union leadership has sold out the membership just in terms of wages, hours, working conditions, and so on. So there is that discontent there. And then I would like to raise a couple of countervailing examples. I'm sure you remember, Davey D, the so-called battle in Seattle in, what was that, 1999, I believe it was. The battle in Seattle against the World Trade Organization. And what happened there? The union leadership tried to have a nice, safe little rally of their members in a stadium somewhere, and the youth went into the streets and faced down the police, the tear gas, and so on. And what happened to the union membership? The great majority of them went with the youth. So you've seen that. And so I do think that if you connect that with the discontent that the great majority of members feel towards their own leadership, that there is the potential for a movement within the labor movement, the rank and file movement. And it won't be easy. There's no guarantee that it'll succeed, but I'd just like to remind people of that analogy that I made to being in a canoe headed down the river towards the Niagara Falls. So,
John Ryman, our guest this afternoon, let me ask you, with that example that you gave, the rank and file went off with the youth. One might argue the rank and file was with the people in Minneapolis. That, whether you want to call it a general strike or not, they were there. And they were doing what they felt needed to be done. I would argue that rank and file members are out and about, trying to make a way out of no way. Now, they won't get coverage. Many people may overlook them in terms of doing interviews, but I would like to think that folks who are ordinary citizens are out there. I'm a member of unions, I'm sure, I think the unions I'm a part of have spoken out on this, but if there's a demonstration or there's a point of view to stand on in solidarity, I'm going to do that regardless of what they do. I don't need leadership to tell me to do that. I'm just going to do that because I feel that my values are aligned with those who are trying to protest this injustice. And so I think that's the way many people operate. The question is, how can you get those masses of people who are operating, whether they're in unions or not, but more importantly, if they're in unions, if you feel that they can really hold some leverage, how do you take that rank and file and get them to move in a particular direction more consistently? Or how do you amplify that rank and file so that they become the de facto leadership and not the person that heads up a particular institution?
Absolutely. That is the other question of the hour. And, in terms of military battle, if you have a small force that's organized and a way larger force that is not organized, the small force is going to win. And so what we need within the rank and file is to start to organize that far larger force. In other words, what you need is organized rank and file caucuses within the unions that are clear on what's happening and have some kind of clarity on what we have to do and what has to be done within the unions, and then start organizing and campaigning within the unions for that.
So when we say organize, and I think, I know we've had Kali and Kuno on and a number of people, they talked about doing general assemblies. I think that was a hallmark of Mandani's campaign, is having, something very similar, if not, having that type of thing. Okay, so we got people organized. What exactly are they supposed to do at this point? And I think for many people, the options are limited. They're saying, John, I was out in the streets. We have people that have gotten killed for being out on the streets. John, I'm driving around in a car and I'm taking pictures of the ICE van. There's numerous people that have been assaulted and gone to jail. John, I did go out and shut down business for a day, but, I eventually I'm going to have to go and get groceries. Eventually I'm going to have to get, some things. So I'm going to have to support those institutions, which are now consolidated. So, yeah, you can boycott Amazon for a day, but pretty soon you're going to use them, And so what exactly at this moment should we be doing? Should people be doing?
So if you're talking about within the unions, we have a petition that we've started that we're hoping to get signatures of union members aimed at their own unions. And I think that there are a couple of things that union members and union supporters can start demanding. One, that their own union leaders call public meetings of all their members and supporters to discuss the serious nature of what we're facing. Two, that they start a genuine public campaign. For instance, Davey D, if you look at the website, you can pick any website at random of any union, from the local unions on up to the AFL-CIO. You will not find anything on those websites discussing the very serious threat that we are facing. So that's just a symptom. Probably very, very few people even look at those websites, but that's a symptom of the cowardice and passivity of the union leadership. So we should be demanding that the union leaders conduct an education campaign, going to the membership, that they set up committees, anti-imperial presidency committees within each union to carry out this campaign of educational campaign within the membership, to go not just at the union meetings, but to go to the workplaces and have meetings there. That we should be demanding that the union leadership organize and call for protests against the plans to overturn the upcoming elections. These are a couple of things that we have to organize, to have an organized group of union members who are willing to stand up to their own leadership. And if such a group starts to gain some traction within the membership, that if the union leadership doesn't do it, that those groups will do it themselves.
So let me come back to a couple of things. I started off by saying we've seen a lot of capitulation, and some of the capitulation may have been folks just ideologically aligned with Trump, so it wasn't really a capitulation. It was an excuse to go along with a plan of action that they've already agreed with. I honestly think there are some universities that, quote unquote, gave in because that's how they really feel. It's like, you just gave me political cover, to shut down points of view, shut down particular types of action, and to move our university or our institution in a direction that we always wanted to go in, but we really couldn't. But now we have no choice. Our quote unquote hands are tied. So I say this to note that, the second part of that is that some of that capitulation came because they were defunded. There's threats of people being arrested, sued, as we noted in one of our previous shows, a number of newspapers and reporters have been sued. And then you have this executive order that is basically saying let's penalize and let's send ICE agents or federal agents after people who are talking about anti-imperialism, who are talking about anti-capitalism, who are basically talking about things that the Trump administration may disagree with. And so with that in mind, folks may look and say, gosh, if I come out here and say this publicly, there's going to be hell to pay. Maybe we lose a bunch of contracts for shipping because there's federal dollars connected to that. Maybe we have nuisance lawsuits that are going to divert our funds. And therefore, we're not going to be able to do anything because we're going to be up in court spending millions of dollars defending ourselves against a frivolous lawsuit brought on by, this administration's Department of Justice or Department of Labor or whatever. There may be a threat of decertifying these folks, so maybe it would be wise not to have anything on a website. Maybe it would be wise not to publicly say something, but to organize clandestinely, to maybe be out in the streets and, the best thing that one could do is not get in the way, not undermine those actions. I think at this point in time, with these extraordinary circumstances, it would be wise not to show all your cards. Do you agree, or is there another way in which we can go about doing this?
Well, I think that's been the argument of the union leadership for the last 80 years, that basically taking that approach. And you can argue that approach, and you can make all the justifications that you like. But the one thing that you cannot do is claim that it's been working, because it's been a disastrous by every measure. If you look at real wages and working conditions, if you look at the standard of living, if you look at what's happening politically, even if you look at the union membership and the degree to the percentage of workers that are in the unions, by every single measure, that approach has been a disastrous failure. And now, look, we have to accept the fact that the existence of unions as independent organizations, that it's not possible without what we could call bourgeois democracy, without the normal democratic means. You see that all throughout history, in every country in the world. And so that argument, just based on the actual facts, is a total disastrous failure. And as far as lawsuits and so on, there's an answer to that. And the answer is, we're going to go out in the street, and if there's any threat of legal action, then we're going to just spread the action, spread our movement and what we're doing, and intensify it even further. And until all threat of legal action, lawsuits and so on, is removed from the table. So, and
you're asking people to make sacrifice. And, you mentioned that you've been at this since 1965, and the things that many people have read about, those are some scary times, but there was a certain amount of gumped and courage that I'm not so sure if people want to go down that path. Maybe they're not scared, but they're like, I've seen people get locked up in prison and do 30, 40 years, and folks are still going to enjoy the Super Bowl, and, they're going to go about their business, and, and thank you. Go political prisoners. We appreciate you. We're going to, reap some of those benefits you fought for, if there was any, and pretty much forgot about them. You don't write a letter. You don't raise money. You don't even mention their names at meetings.
Yeah.
Others have seen, outright assassinations and undermining, et cetera, and so, if I got 2 kids, John, and I can barely make it, I don't know if I want to make that sacrifice. I appreciate that you did, but I'm not built like that. Right. And that's a very real, that's a reality that we have to factor in to the equation. I'm not willing to go to jail and pay the price that you all did in the 50s, because guess what? We're worse off than we were back then. in many ways.
Exactly, exactly. And that shows the disastrous failure of that attitude. And you put that on top of the threat to all democratic norms, and I mean democratic with a small d. It's exactly because you have kids or grandkids that you have to stand up now and take those risks. You know, Davey D, back in the 1960s, a whole layer of youth in Germany turned to their parents and said, "What were you doing back 30 years ago? What did you do to oppose that?" And I'm telling you, if we're still around, if we survive this period, there's going to be a layer of youth, our own children, our own grandchildren, that are going to turn on us, or they'll have every right to turn to us and say, "What did you do to stop this?" So it's exactly for the youth, more than anything else, that we have, yeah, there's a risk. No, there's no guarantee of success. Yes, it's very difficult. Yes to all of that. But you have to think about the alternatives. And
would you say today's movements are youth led? Because I see a lot of quote unquote youth or young adults. They're out there right now, and we've heard some people maybe make off-putting remarks like, this ain't your father or mother's, or grandparents' civil rights movement, right? They would say that, and then one would look and be like, well, my grandparents were Panthers. They really paid a price. So you as a younger generation haven't really done that. And so I guess what I'm looking at is, or what I'm getting at, is that there are people, young and old, there are people that are from the 60s, like yourself, alongside groups of people that are out now that are doing what they feel, that's within their disposal. They were out there in frigid weather striking or protesting. They've been doing ice watches. They've been trying to do whatever they can. There is a layer of people that include both youth and older folks who are sitting at home comfortable, maybe just hoping that they could, parse this out at the election, or maybe just don't want to be involved at all. So I think we have three different categories. I guess what I come down to is, if we remove the notion of national, actions and just look at things locally, what do you think we could do? Are there lessons that we could learn just immediately from looking at Chicago, looking at Minneapolis? What would be the best practice moving forward that we can locally do? So I'll put out a few things. You got SEIOU, you have the longshoremen, you have teachers unions. What would you like the unions right here in the Bay Area to do? 2 or 3 steps that you feel that they could take over the next month or so to help stem the tide, or move things in another direction that's within their purview locally.
So I think that union members here in this area, that they can and should organize along the lines of what I'm talking about. And, build independent caucuses that are in opposition to their own union leadership, independent from their own union leadership, to make the kind of demands that I'm referring to. I'd also like to raise a different aspect of this same issue. And, in every mass movement, it's always been the youth that have been in the vanguard. And we see here all throughout the country, but certainly throughout California, we see high school students walking out, right? Mm-hmm. Here in Oakland, all the way up in Placerville, which is, strong Trump country. There was walkout of high school students. And many of those students, they have parents, they have family members who are union members. So that can be an approach, I think, that the young people turn to the older people, turn to the union members and say, look, mom, dad, cousin, whoever, neighbor, you have a potential power here, and we urge you to organize along these same lines. So I think that those are two approaches. But as I say, the main thing is that we have to organize, demand that the unions lead a movement, including organized mass protests during a workday, during work hours. I've been to all kinds of protests here in the Bay Area over all kinds of different issues. And you almost never ever see any sizable union contingent at those protests. So that's the kind of thing that we have to change.
When I think of unions, people feel, well, they have resources. And, maybe they have money for signs. Maybe they have money for phone banking. And to be honest, I think that's why I think a lot of resources are going to go towards, getting people out to vote. I think resources are going to be devoted to making sure people are registered, in spite of all the obstacles that are being put forth. That's what I think people are kind of gearing up for. And that's something that we have to factor into the game plan as well, that a lot of people are looking towards these midterms. That's where all the chips are in. And if that's the case, is there some smaller steps that can be taken that can either enhance the work that's being done or at least provide a viable alternative just in case these midterms are canceled and folks are left with, no changing of the guard through the electoral process?
So, again, it's absolutely clear that Trump, if he can get away with it, has plans to suppress the vote illegally and unconstitutionally, has plans to suppress the vote and, if necessary, overturn these elections. And as we know, take here in Oakland, it doesn't really matter in and of itself the outcome of the midterm elections here in Oakland. What matters is the outcome of the midterm elections in Philadelphia, in Minneapolis, in some of the pro-democratic districts in states like Texas. And that's where Trump is going to turn to suppress the vote. And so we have to look at the elections in terms of that national strategy that Trump has. And it's not going to be this. I think that the chances of this election being anything like any other election that we've had, the chances are extremely, extremely low. And the Democrats' plans, which are also the plans of the union leadership, is have as great a turnout of people who oppose the MAGA Republicans, as great a turnout as possible. But Trump does not. If you just look at Trump organized an insurrection against the national election. I'm talking about January 6th. So he's going to, there's nothing, he has no boundaries. He has no guardrails. So sure, fine, organize looking towards the November elections. But part of that organizing has to be organizing for defense of our democratic right to vote. And let's not forget the democratic right to vote for black people in the South was not won by just simply going and registering to vote. It was won by a huge mass protest that in some ways practically paralyzed the country.
Do you really think that it paralyzed the country, or was it a political calculation? I mean, because the Voting Rights Act is signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? And, it seemed more like a political calculation than it was him being overwhelmed with power. And maybe we have to kind of have that sobering reality, because we didn't necessarily see movements, even though there were mass demonstrations. In some places where there were boycotts, going back to the Montgomery bus boycott, you might have saw, you know, the losing of dollars, you know, leading to people concluding that, okay, maybe we need to open up the doors. But even just using that example, if you go back, you had the White Citizens Council and all those folks, they were digging in. They were like, yeah, well, I don't care. We don't want your money. We got enough money. We'll be all right. I mean, watch Eyes on the Prize. They show that. They show, like, when we had mass meetings, they had mass meetings, right? And folks were gung-ho in terms of, like, I ain't giving up no rights, no matter what. So until a larger force, in this case, the federal government's like, we will send troops down there, we will federalize the National Guard, we will do these things, and maybe somebody found it within their moral center if they had one, or they just made a shrewd political calculation to move in another direction versus being pushed. And I'm just trying to see an example where folks looked out the window and said, whew, I better move in this direction, otherwise it's going to be hell to pay.
Yeah, you're right. Saying it paralyze the country is a slight exaggeration. And I think that what really happened behind the scenes was, we have to remember that this was the era in which people in Africa were winning political independence, right? Independent nations, at least politically independent. And the United States was locked in a propaganda battle with the Soviet Union for who was going to influence those the African continent. And it didn't look good. It was not exactly helpful for their influence to see scenes almost on a daily basis of black people being whipped, beaten, had dogs set on them, tear gas, and so on. So they had to make this concession. So, and we don't have that today. We don't have the Soviet Union and that kind of rivalry today.
Right. So it was fair. The guardrails that you talked about was really based around the Cold War. And to your point, John Ryman, that is a well-stated strategy. If you watch Eyes on the Prize, Coretta Scott King, and others in that series continuously talk to that. Like, look, the United States is locked in a battle, as you said. They're saying they're the beacon of democracy. Come to our shores, and you'll see that we're better than communism and socialism and other ism. And in order to win that battle, they couldn't afford to have the heightening of contradictions, which is what King and others did. So they put on their Sunday best. They looked for the media to cover them, and, you know, images of people getting knocked upside the head won the day in many ways, because it just, you know, drew ire from the other countries. But this administration doesn't care about what other countries think. In fact, it's like, we want to take over these other countries, so they are clear that they are an imperial force. We'll take over Venezuela. We want Greenland. We want to annex Canada. So they don't, you know, they could give two, you know, I'm not going to curse on the air. So that guardrail of how you're going to be perceived is not in play anymore. And to a certain degree, I think people are still acting on that. We can go to the United Nations and we could, you know, get the World Court. It's like, you know, bring it on is what they're saying. Bring it on, because we're not going to change our minds. So there has to be some other things that we can do. And I think when you talked about, you know, the overthrowing of colonialism in some of these African nations, you know, John, it came because people were like, let me pick up these guns and let me do guerrilla warfare and have outright war in many of those places. And, you know, we're getting to a point where that might have to be the case, you know, and I think people are real hesitant, like, do I really have to do this? Because that's a whole other different calculation at this point. That's a whole other thing. Like, if ICE comes down, we're armed up, we will shoot them back, and we're ready to go toe-to-toe. That's how some people were acting in many of these places, and yeah, that's a hard thing to stomach for a lot of folks here, especially when their rank and file might have joined ICE because they're looking at a $50,000 benefit. bonus check. Some of our rank and file are working for ICE because they can get their student loans paid for. So they're looking at a sense of normalcy. And they can, wear a mask and go beat up people who they never liked. Oh, sign me up. So there's a group of people that have already picked up arms, and another group of people that's saying, I don't want to pick up arms. I don't want to go there. And increasingly, it's looking like that might be something that you have to put on the table. I don't know how you digest that. I don't know how you even talk about that. You can't do it publicly, So is that what we're headed? Is this what we're getting at? Is this what the union should be organizing? Or because it seems like they're going to have folks exhaust everything before they realize, like, damn, I better pick up these guns as they're passing laws now to make it more difficult.
So if you look at some of the scenes of ICE raiding different workplaces, of raiding different homes and stuff, and you think about that, there is absolutely no chance, none whatsoever, zero, that a relatively small group of people armed with AR-15s and that sort of thing, that they will be able to stand up to those raids. There's no chance whatsoever. So, again, what I'm saying is we can't forget our true source of power, which is our ability to shut down the workplace, to shut down the U.S. economy, starting with those three industries that I mentioned: the airlines industry, the shipping, which is exports and imports, and the railroads. I remember, just take one example. It was just a momentary one, but it shows. Back in 2020, I'm sorry, in 2017, when Trump first came into office, and he instituted the Muslim ban. And what happened? Youth they didn't go and protest outside the airports. We went into the airport, like at SFO, we went into the airport, and what could they do? They couldn't tear gas us all. They couldn't lock us up because you can't distinguish between the protesters and passengers. And it shut down SFO. And
did it shut it down? Because
yes.
John, I was at those protests. I took pictures. I was there. I brought my young daughter. She has a picture on the wall right now. She had to be like 4 or 5 years old, saying, protest, right? All they did was move people to another gate. There were protests at the SFO when, around the genocide. And look, I agree that you have to show up and you have to be disruptive and all that. And yeah, there was disruption, right? We went over here and they were like, okay, your flight might be delayed. Go to gate number 16 instead of 17. Go to terminal B instead of terminal A. You really needed, a lot more people. I mean, thousands of more people to really have shut that down. And we had hundreds, not thousands, at that march. If I'm looking at my pictures, that I covered that. I was there. I mean, there were a lot of people, but they just moved the things to the other gates.
So what I recall was, at least for a short time, the international flights were stopped.
Yes, because that's where everybody went first.
Yeah.
So, but they moved it to other gates.
And as you say, there was a few hundred, not thousands, and the labor movement was totally uninvolved. But that shows what can be accomplished fairly easily. Let's not forget also, there have been protests at the port of Oakland where the workers, the longshore workers, refused to cross the picket lines.
Mm-hmm.
So these are just, you could point out, and I would agree with you, that these things were not entirely successful. But they give a view of what can be done if the labor movement were to really organize.
So the choice you have, John, is, and this is what I'm hearing, the potential for it is there if we can get, like, say, all the people that we saw during Occupy. Remember that? 100,000 people showed up and show it out. And can you get that number of people continuously to do what you're saying? That's, can it be scaled up on that level where, for the next few days or weeks or whatever, people are going to do that. And that's where mutual aid and all the other things that we talked about come into play. And I think that's something to be worked towards. But as we're barreling down, this situation where, maybe election is going to be a turning point. Maybe if they fully staff ICE and get all these, projects built out, which are going to be internment camps, before that gets all into place, can you get these masses of people to really, stop these gears from moving? Or is there another way to go about doing this that doesn't require as much organizing when we don't have the full platforms? We can't organize online anymore because of algorithms. Legacy media is not talking about it. I mean, we'll talk about it, but we're far and in between. The next platform that can. So, is there any other steps that we can take?
No. That's to me. That's the answer.
Wow.
I mean, everything else that has been tried has been a disastrous failure. And not just under Trump, but as I said, if you go back, look, I'm going to be 80 in this May. If you go back during my entire lifetime, you've seen everything. You've seen a steady slippage, step by step by step. And under the policies and the approach, the strategy that has been implemented for all that time. Now we're at a whole new stage under those policies, and the steady drip, drip, drip of failure now threatens to turn into an absolute flood, a disaster. So, no, there's no guarantee of success. It's extremely, there's a lot of risk. But I'd like to turn our attention somewhere else, to Iran. Look at what the people there are doing. I mean, it's so absolutely heroic. I think they estimated that the government there has killed 5,000 people so far. Maybe even more than that. So, if they can do that, if the people of Ukraine can stand up to that racist, ethno-nationalist dictator, Putin, if they can do those things, then we can too.
Yeah, but the U.S. supports those movements clandestinely, maybe even, help spark. Yeah, I mean, the folks that are protesting in Iran, sure, they're going to get help, because it's in the U.S. interest to overthrow what's going on there, right?
No.
I mean, this is not to take away from people who have a genuine disdain, but we've always meddled in affairs where it looks like the wind is blowing in that direction. That's in my favor. Let's do that. I mean, Venezuela would be a perfect example. They can show masses in the streets, but are those masses in the streets, backed by the U.S., or those masses in the streets that's genuine? And that becomes a whole other debate, and we can do other shows on that. But we've seen how we've meddled in affairs and then painted a picture. And the point I'm getting at is that if this is to happen, who's going to help us from outside? They accuse us of having help from outside, saying Russia was helping and, Venezuela was helping and, all that sort of stuff, which becomes the excuse to go after folks. But were they really helping the way that the U.S. has meddled?
Well, if you look at Iran, if you listen to the voices of the people in Iran, it's absolutely crystal clear that they're not out in the street, that they're not actually getting any help from Trump and company. Trump and company is mouthing some words and trying to use that movement to install his favorite, which is the son of the former Shah, who has very little, if any, support, incidentally, within the movement there in Iran. But it's not just a fixture of Trump, but you know, as you say, that's a
Well,
whole.
not Trump, but I'm saying the U.S. The U.S. has
Oh,
always
the
sent
U.S. in general.
the
No,
CIA, and there's
no,
been those interferences in the past, and I'm not, and this is not to take away from the genuine, earnest efforts that are taking place, but I am saying that when it seems to be scaled up, a lot of times it is because there's been outside, you know, there's been outside agitation at the very least, if not influence.
well, I think that if you look at the actual facts, if you listen to the people that are actually involved in the movement, and that includes incidentally in Ukraine, it's crystal clear that people mobilize on their own. Same with the Arab Spring, that people mobilize on their own because the situation was not tolerable to them. They felt that they had to. And of course, outside influences always try to use any movement that they can for their own benefit. But
Right. So the Arab Spring is a great example. So we saw it happen in Egypt, we saw it happen in Tunisia, and then we saw the U.S.'s footprints all over what was going on in Libya. And we've done tons of shows to show all that crazy stuff. And at the end of the day, the forces that took over and the forces that we aligned ourselves with and influenced, started enslaving black folks over there that are still enslaved today, right? But the picture that was painted was like, look, that Arab Spring is over there. And they tried to, paint this picture. And people said the momentum is there. And we the Cynthia McKinneys and everybody that we know that came on went over there and came back and said, there's a whole other different story. And they pointed out that contradiction. And that's the point I'm making is that, a lot of times, we have meddled in these affairs overtly and clandestinely. And if we are to stand up in the way that you're saying, because you use those as examples, it's China and Russia or whoever that may have a opposing interest to the U.S. Are they going to influence that in some form or fashion?
So, as I think we both agree, this is a whole, like, it's a connected topic, but it's not the same. And
Yeah.
And I think I sent you that interview with that black reporter in Ukraine, Terrell Jermaine Starr, where he interviewed a journalist, an African journalist. And I think that interview is extremely interesting. But everything that you say about the United States is true, about the difficulties we face. And what I answer is, what choice do we face? What alternative is there? Because everything else has failed. There's in all likelihood that just simply relying on trying to get as many votes for the Democrats in come November, that there's very, very little likelihood that in itself will succeed. And so how will we answer the next generations when they ask us, what did you do? What did you do to stop this? Are we going to say, well, I went out to vote? Is that going to
that is the question for the ages. John, we're going to have to cut it here.
Okay.
I wanted people to find out where they can follow you, where they can read you, where they can engage with you.
So I would urge people to look at my blog site, Oakland Socialist, that's all one word, Oaklandsocialist.com. And we're going to have that petition, probably by the time this show is aired, that petition will be on the blog site as well as elsewhere. If they're interested in knowing more, they can contact me. Well, I would suggest contact me through my email address, Oaklandsocialist, all one word, Oaklandsocialist@gmail.com.
John Raymond, we appreciate you taking time out. We're going to take a break on Hard Knock Radio.
Thanks very much, Davey D.
We'll be right back.